everyone, welcome. I'm Diana Martin. I'm the Executive Director here at Hourglass, and I'd like to welcome you to today's First Friday Forum on Food Insecurity in Lancaster County. Today we're joined by Zook and Don Watson from the Policy Research Team at the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank, who have been working on an extensive hunger mapping initiative for our community. Later this month, they will be releasing a final report on the project, but today they're going to give us a preview of what they've learned so far on the extent of food insecurity in Lancaster, as well as the primary causes and recommendations for how we can move forward as a community. After their talk, we'll have some time for questions from the audience, and if you're watching via live stream, please just drop those questions in the chat. I'd like to thank our First Friday Forum sponsor, Rogers & Associates, for making these forums possible, and Millersville University and the Ware Center for hosting us today. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our speakers and interested in learning more. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Zook. I'm the Senior Policy Research Manager at the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank, and I'm here today with my colleague, Don Watson, who's the Policy Research Coordinator at the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank as well. We're excited to talk with you all about our Lancaster County Hunger Mapping project, which has been an extensive 12-month process, collaborative with many different community organizations across Lancaster County, including the Hunger-Free Lancaster County Coalition and Community Action Partnership of Lancaster County. We were funded by Steinman Foundation, High Foundation, and Lancaster County Community Foundation, who supported this project throughout the duration. So our talk today will go over the 4 key aspects of our research, which we divide into a food security analysis, charitable food access assessment, and then we talk about the utilization of key government programs. And finally, for one of the first times, we'll be talking about intersecting and upstream issues that face people who visit food pantries in Lancaster County. We had 6 specific research questions within each of that fell into these 4 categories. So the first research question that we had is just basically, what is the extent of food insecurity in Lancaster County, and where is it most concentrated? We then asked, who is most impacted by food insecurity, and how does that vary by a variety of different attributes? Turning to charitable food access, we wanted to know, how accessible is charitable food in the county, and how does it vary based on where you live in Lancaster County? And what access barriers exist, and where correspondingly might food distribution and utilization gaps exist across the county? On section 3, we asked, what is the utilization rates of key government programs such as SNAP, WIC, and school breakfast and school lunch programs? And finally, we know that food insecurity is caused by a variety of upstream factors, including economic insecurity, housing insecurity, and a variety of other things. And we wanted to understand what issues were most impacting people who visited food pantries across Lancaster County. So we had a very extensive data collection process that proceeded in 3 phases. So our first phase was a secondary data analysis, where we pulled data from a variety of different sources that was related to food insecurity. So that includes USDA data, Pennsylvania Department of Human Services data, Department of Health data, as well as using American Community Survey data and a variety of attributes from that really fantastic data source. Our primary data collection phase was the second phase of our research, and that included talking with nearly 2,000 food insecure individuals across the county. And so we did 740 household level surveys at 12 pantries geographically spread out across Lancaster County, and they represented about 1,600 individuals. We also did qualitative research, including 4 focus groups and extended one-on-one interviews to try to better understand how people are experiencing food insecurity in Lancaster County. We involved a wide variety of actors in the charitable food system and included 4 food pantry listening sessions. So those were held across different spots of the county as well, and included nearly 30 agencies, and we had almost 40 agencies complete our partner survey to better understand the different attributes of food pantries across Lancaster County and how they vary. And then finally, we undertook an effort to understand utilization gaps at the census tract level using anonymized data sharing across 18 of our largest pantries. And so we got 86% participation in this regard, and it represents one of the first in the nation attempts to understand at a very localized way how people are experiencing the accessibility of food pantries, and it will allow us going forward to be able to target resources in a very evidence-based manner. So what is the extent of food insecurity in Lancaster County? Nearly 50,000 Lancastrians experience food insecurity. That equates to about 8.7% of the population. Areas of high food insecurity, which we define in the report as areas that have a food insecurity rate greater than the county average of about 9%. They're concentrated largely along Route 30, Route 222, and the Route 283 corridors, as well as specific census tracts within Lancaster City. And so I'll talk about census tracts throughout the presentation today, but as a brief definition, we use census tracts compared to zip codes because they're much more localized, they have more even population distributions, and in urban areas like Lancaster City, they represent neighborhoods, and then in suburban and rural areas, they're more coterminous with municipality boundaries. We find, using Feeding America data, that children are the most likely to experience food insecurity in Lancaster County, and through our research and talking with folks across Lancaster County, as well as national data on this, parents are the most likely to go hungry, even though kids are the most likely to experience food insecurity. We've talked with folks who talked about how they would wait for their kids to go to bed and not eat until then so that they could eat whatever was left over. So parents really sacrifice so that their children can eat first. Food insecurity also varies dramatically by race and ethnicity in Lancaster County. Black and Hispanic individuals have a food insecurity rate of 21% compared to 6% for white non-Hispanic individuals. We also wanted to provide a brief definition of food insecurity. We'll be using some technical terms throughout the presentation. So food insecurity, we'll focus on the bottom two parts of that triangle. It is broken up into low food security, which is defined by worrying about being able to access food, but it's not reduced food intake. So when we get to very low food security, that is the most severe form of food insecurity that the USDA defines, and that's defined by reduced intake, and so is our best measure of hunger in Lancaster County. So Lancaster County has a food insecurity rate of 8.7%. We wanted to compare this to the national level. It is about 2 percentage points below the national level of food insecurity. We plotted trends from USDA data of food insecurity and very low food insecurity over time. You can see that food insecurity rates are very dependent upon economic conditions. So you'll see a dramatic spike when you reach the Great Recession, and then followed by a very slow below 10% in the whole history of our measuring food insecurity over the last 25 years. And that's even amidst some of the lowest unemployment, some of the best economic conditions that we've had, late 90s, right before the COVID pandemic. And so it's going to take more than just the best economic conditions to get food insecurity below that 10% threshold. It will take really strategic and collaborative investments at the local, state, and federal levels. Compared to our South Central PA counterparts, Lancaster County, again, is slightly lower than surrounding counties except for Chester County. The child food insecurity rate, again, is slightly lower than surrounding counties with the exception of Chester County. So the child food insecurity rate is 11.9% compared to an overall rate of 8.7%. We also calculated an adult food insecurity rate of 7.7%, which means that children are 55% more likely to face food insecurity than adults in Lancaster County, which is a really dramatic disparity. So a recommendation that we have around this finding is that it's critically important for us to focus resources on households with children and children themselves, as they're the most likely to face food insecurity in the county. Turning to some of our results from our food pantry surveys. So again, we completed 740 household surveys across 12 different pantries in Lancaster County. We found that very low food security was really surprisingly prevalent among people who visit food pantries. And this is defined by, again, reduced food intake on a consistent basis. So we propose that the charitable food system and other policymakers use very low food security as a critical metric of success, and reducing food insecurity over time as that measure of success as a coalition. So rates, again, are near 50%. On the next slide, I'll show a breakdown by household composition. But nearly a quarter of all individuals who visit a food pantry experience a very extreme form of very low food security, which is defined as missing meals and going hungry every single month. So that's a really high rate of individuals. And again, we believe that the charitable food system and other policymakers should institute policies and programs to make progress towards reducing very low food security over time. Turning to household compositions and how very low food security varies by household type. Very low food security is lowest for households with seniors, senior households. This is consistent with USDA data. And in our data, we find that this is likely because seniors, although they have very low incomes, about $1,000 to $2,000 a month on average, they also have the more consistent incomes. And there's several government and nonprofit programs targeted towards seniors that seem to be very successful at keeping rates of seniors experiencing reduced food intake and very low food security lower than other household types. Other household types are more likely to experience wide variations in income. So again, these findings are consistent with national estimates by the USDA, but kind of staggering differences by household type. Some good news, or mixed news, I would say. So if you remember the chart of food insecurity over time, we can never get below that 10% threshold. In 2021, we actually did, especially for children. In Lancaster County in 2021, child food insecurity dropped by 35%. And this was in large part due to the expanded child tax credit. If you're familiar with that, it provided $3,600 a year, $300 a month for children's ages 0 to 5, and $250 a month for children's ages 6 to 17. So that investment in children, and again, a very well-targeted investment given the data that we've reviewed, really had a major impact on the experience of food insecurity for children in Lancaster County. And we know that long-term, this will have an impact on their productivity, on their educational attainment, and a variety of things that food insecurity and the experiences of food insecurity can kind of take away from in developmental stages. So we suggest, again, the expanded child tax credit. These low barrier programs have a very large impact on food insecurity. It's amazing how big of a difference just $3,000 per kid can make. And we propose for the Charitable Food Network to advocate for similar policies that prioritize agency and dignity, give people choice. And pantries should adapt and implement policies and programs in kind of that view as well. So turning to section 2 in our charitable food access, we find in our research that food pantries are already the lowest barrier social service access points in the county. They're the first place that people turn to, which is very good for the charitable food system. However, we find that there's significant access barriers that still remain. So in the report, we go over all of these access barriers in turn. You can see I have them listed on the screen. And today I'll go over geographic access barriers, hours of operation access barriers, income requirements, and treatment of pantry visitors. So while food pantries do serve as this lowest social service access point, there is still work to be done on that front, and we'll go over many of the ways that we can address that collaboratively as a charitable food system. We also find that the charitable food system, there's lots of opportunities to increase collaboration. It is by design a decentralized system, and in many ways this can be very good. As Dawn will talk about, pantries are trusted community assets, and they're members of the communities in which they're situated. But there's also room for coordinating bodies like Hunger-Free Lancaster County to provide resources to help pantries improve their services even further. So at listening sessions, folks discussed the need for food pantry sourcing strategies and guidance on that front. Together, we can strategically invest in underserved areas. And it's important that we share information of available pantries. Information frictions is a major issue for people who face food insecurity, so getting the word out about available resources is critically important. And finally, there's opportunities for other types of collaboration and trainings and resources that Hunger-Free Lancaster can provide to pantries across the county. So turning to some of the specific access barriers, what we did was we did a 15-minute drive time radius around each census tract center of population, and then we calculated the number of food pantries within that drive time radius. And so the resulting map that you see here is the number of food insecure individuals per census tract per pantry in like each area across the county. So as an example, southern Lancaster County, each of these census tracts, there's about 250 food insecure individuals per available pantry. So in southern Lancaster County, one pantry has about 2,000 food insecure individuals to serve. So it's potentially an underserved area of the county. And similarly, you can see in northwestern Lancaster County, around the E-Town area, there are fewer pantries per food insecure individual in the county. An interesting note that I wanted to point out is Mount Joy has sufficient geographic access to pantries. However, there's an issue of service territories, whereas pantries place restrictions, like people can only come from certain school districts. And so that makes Mount Joy, these residents, actually uniquely disadvantaged because they can't go to a variety of surrounding pantries because they're not in their school district. This was the results of, again, one of the first in the nation estimates of food pantry utilization at the census tract level. And so using anonymized data from 18 pantries across the county, we subtracted the number of food pantry visitors from each census tract by the number of food insecure individuals in each census tract. And the resulting map is again, a gap analysis of food pantry utilization across Lancaster County. So you can see there's utilization gaps in southern Lancaster County, in parts of northeast Lancaster County, and in northwest Lancaster County. And these maps will only get better over time as we expand electronic intake and as we increase partnerships with pantries across the county. So this will be a really great measure to, in a very evidence-based and informed manner, to invest strategically in certain areas of the county and increase access to charitable food in these areas. We did an hours of operation analysis. So there's a lot of folks who visit food pantries. You'll see that in the data. But we believe that they're actually underrepresented in our data because of barriers to access, such as pantries only being open during the traditional workday. So off-hours access is a really critically important component of access. All the tan areas of Lancaster County on this map are areas that have no pantries within a 15-minute drive time that are open on the weekends. And so that amounts to about 31% of food insecure individuals without access to a weekend distribution. And so if you're a working household, it'll be very hard for you to access that additional help that you may need. And then 23% of households with a similar analysis at the evening distribution level do not have access to an evening distribution. We did a similar analysis at the walking level for Lancaster City, and that'll be included in the full report. So it's really important for Hunger-Free Lancaster County for pantries to coordinate across each other's work. It's very important that not every pantry needs to be or should be everything to everyone, but if we work collaboratively, we can make sure that people have access to food when they need it. Just a note, going back to the service territories, if we were to eliminate service territories, that would automatically increase access by about 20 to 25% in off-hours distributions. I also wanted to briefly talk about income requirements and the ALICE population. So that's a United Way definition, meaning asset limited, income constrained, and employed. About 26% of households in Lancaster County fall into that category. And that includes many individuals who are above 185% of the federal poverty line, and that's the traditional cutoff to be eligible for federally and state-funded charitable food. So we found in our surveys that food pantries have really inconsistent policies about how to serve households who are over that 185% of the federal poverty line, but who are still ALICE and are working poor, having trouble making ends meet on a consistent basis. And so we find that the ALICE population, when they visit a food pantry, their experience will be dramatically different based on which food pantry they visit. And in kind of the the goal of having no wrong door for any household, it's really important that we establish consistent policies around that. We find that around 30% of pantries will either turn these households away or only serve them once and say that they can't come back. So this represents another opportunity for consistent policies across the charitable food system to make sure that people are served. I am going to hand it to Dawn, who will talk about pantry treatment.
Did you leave that on?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we know sort of the background information about where the pantries are and how they're doing, but what about when people get to the pantry? What's their experience like? How are they treated? And how did they then sort of reflect that back to us? And then what does the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank want Lancaster to do about it, right? So we have found that in our interactions with our neighbors who visit pantries that, you know, the treatment that they experience and their interaction with the volunteers and staff at these pantries is incredibly important. Every single one of these interactions count. Folks who are maybe feeling nervous, embarrassed, ashamed about needing to access charitable food anticipate going in and maybe not having like the greatest experience. That being said, in Lancaster in particular, people did report to us that they did feel welcome at their pantries that are in their communities, that they felt, you know, that that was a part of their network, and that, you know, that was something that they were willing to access, in fact, sometimes more readily than a government function like the welfare office, the WIC office, places like that. So that provides us with a really unique opportunity to keep people feeling welcome and increase the feelings of, you know, the dignity and choice that people have when they access charitable food. And it's not necessarily just the relationship of the giver to the receiver, but also the community aspect of people who are coming in and seeing their neighbor who is in need and building on that relationship to help people out. Which is kind of, you know, that's the point of our charitable food network, right, is to help people. So, you know, one of the things that we are hoping to work with Hunger-Free Lancaster County on is just increasing the volunteer training opportunities and encouraging, you know, those welcoming behaviors, because every interaction counts and everybody should be able to go in with the same, you know, amount of information on how to best serve folks. In one of our focus groups, we had an individual who said, I know a lot of volunteers and I appreciate it, but some people feel bad enough walking through this line. You don't have to be rude. If you ask a question, sometimes you don't even get answers. It is important to note that the folks who did reflect back to us that, you know, they had an experience that maybe wasn't positive, they were very specific about what had happened. They could remember what the volunteer was wearing. They remember what was said, and at times it had been months, if not years, into the past. Those experiences stick with people. And so changing that environment is an important part of helping people get services that they are that they need. When you go to a pantry, and some of you may know this and some of you may not, there are requirements when you walk in the door. Now, from the Charitable Food Network standpoint, we ask folks to sign a self-declaration that says these are the people in my household and this is the income that we have. Some pantries, a majority of the pantries actually in our service area require photo ID. Some will require residency proof, which is usually like a utility bill. There are some pantries also that ask folks to attend other classes, meet with a counselor or case manager as well. Some pantries limit visits and you can go once per month. Others are weekly. Again, we know that people trust food pantries, and so we encourage them to continue to be this low barrier access point for folks. Additional documentation requirements should really be evaluated for their purpose and use when you're asking folks to provide this information, especially if you have somebody coming in at a crisis scenario. If they don't come in with the right documentation and you turn them away without food, like, what are we really doing? we think also that, these are easy goals to achieve when people take a look at, when the organizations take a look at what they're doing and why they're doing it. Along with how people are treated, there's a disparity in the pantries themselves. And we see that by self-report, pantries that are in Lancaster City have a lower storage capacity than pantries that are outside of the city area. And I mean, you can see this is for like certain reasons, is that sometimes you are in a building that is just small and it does not have maybe the same infrastructure as something that was built later on. However, this has an impact on what type of pantry services can be offered. And can have to do with, whether or not somebody is handed a bag of prepackaged food that is chosen for them, or if they have the opportunity to access a pantry that we call client choice, which means that you can go through and choose different options based on what the pantry has available. Those choices for our pantry visitors are very important to them. And so when we have a situation where that's not an option because of just the literal size and availability for the pantry, that represents an opportunity for our charitable food network and for our community to invest in those pantries and improve that for folks. So I think we've been pretty clear that pantries are a community asset. Neighbors trust them, and sometimes trust them more than they trust the government. One way that this can be leveraged is for pantries to potentially reduce some of the stigma around government programs. These programs exist, SNAP, WIC, in order to help folks who are experiencing or are likely to be experiencing food insecurity. So it represents kind of leaving money on the table if the folks who are eligible are not actually receiving those benefits. One of the recommendations from our report is that, through Hunger-Free Lancaster, we're hoping that some pantries will be more willing to engage in this type of work, even if it's just in reducing the stigma and speaking positively about these programs, all the way up to helping people complete and renew benefits that they are eligible for. I think that I've essentially said all of this, but really and truly, the support of this is so important, because when you have an organization, when you have a question about something that you need, it's easier to go to an organization that you already know and trust and work on that community relationship than it is to be sent to what may feel like a very sterile or unfamiliar environment, like a government office. Or where you have maybe already had not a great experience, or you have questions that you're reluctant to ask, which is why it's important to potentially leverage this. Our SNAP participation in Lancaster County, you'd like to think that if so many people are eligible, everybody would be signed up, but that is not the case. About 50% of pantry visitors that we were surveying are receiving SNAP benefits. And we know that the federal poverty income guidelines for people who are considered eligible for charitable food and the level of people who are eligible to receive SNAP benefits it's not the same, but it is similar. And so from that, you can sort of extrapolate that people who are at food pantries are probably eligible for SNAP. About 20% of the people that we spoke to had never even applied for SNAP benefits. And there are plenty of reasons why people maybe don't apply for SNAP or are not currently eligible. But this, again, represents kind of a piece of information that the pantries could be working with folks on in order to support them. One sort of little factoid that gets tossed out a lot is that SNAP can provide 9 times the meals that the Charitable Food Network can provide. For every 1 meal that charitable food provides, SNAP provides 9. So again, it's a resource that people have access to and should be able to use. The impact of SNAP on the Charitable Food Network is also important to note as well, because when folks were eligible for the maximum amount of SNAP benefits during the COVID-19 health emergency, they had a food budget that was helping them meet their needs. Once those emergency allotments ended, the increase in folks coming to food pantries, it went up by quite a bit. And that has kind of been sustained. I know that Paige McFarling is here, and she's also collecting that information about her pantry visitors, and has been kind of putting that out there as well. People on the ground are seeing this, and it shows that people are going to do what they need to meet their needs, but that a program like the SNAP and the emergency allotments made a big difference in how people were able to manage their food budget. WIC participation. So WIC is Women, Infants, and Children. It is a program that is designed specifically for pregnant people and parents and kids under the age of 5. Whereas SNAP is sort of a household of eligibility that's much broader. WIC is geared toward children and families with children under the age of 5, in case that was a definition I should have provided earlier. So what you need to know about WIC, from me at least, is that WIC participation in Lancaster is not great, and that it has always been, a bit low. But as through the pandemic, the numbers have not recovered. And in Pennsylvania overall, people are back to pre-pandemic levels to receive WIC, but not necessarily in Lancaster County. WIC is difficult to access for folks. The requirements are much more stringent than they are with SNAP or other government programs. And Pennsylvania itself is kind of at the tail end of modernizing this program. And so what people may experience in other states is very different than what they experience here. So there's work to be done, which is, we have had conversations at the state level, and it is coming, but as with many things, it moves slowly. And Zach is actually going to break this down a little bit further and show where the greatest need and WIC eligible folks actually are.
All right, so now that we identified, and this chart here shows that WIC participation in Lancaster County relative to December 2020 is down 11%, and in the state, it's pretty much recovered. So at the county level, we identified this issue, and we wanted to zoom in to see what are the practical applications of increasing WIC participation. So we got data from the Department of Health at the zip code level from May 2020 to May 2023. Zip codes 17603, 17602 actually experienced the second and fourth largest drops in WIC participation in the whole state. And those are very large zip codes. They're about 4th and 20th in population, but they're still kind of overweighted in terms of the drop of participation. And they dropped by a significant amount, 400 people in 17603 and 285 in 17602. So again, at the zip code level, this provides us some granularity. But it doesn't necessarily, we can't necessarily advertise WIC in all of these areas. So to target it even further, we have data at the census tract level. So within these zip codes, and we've been working with Community Action Partnership of Lancaster on this, and just talked to them earlier about this week. There's specific census tracts where there are most likely eligible kids for WIC. So using ACS data, we identified southwest Lancaster Township and the northeast part of Manor Township in 17603, and then the Church Street neighborhood and northeast Lancaster City in zip code 17602. If we did specific WIC outreach in these particular areas, we could have the most return on investment for increasing WIC participation back to levels that it previously was before the pandemic. Turning to school breakfast and school lunch programs, we also have an analysis of summer food programs in our report. But some very good news, actually from just yesterday, the universal school breakfast, it will be in place over the coming year as well. And we measured the impact in Lancaster County on school breakfast participation rates from 2019 to 2022 when it was also in place. And we find that school breakfast participation increased by 40% among Lancaster County schools, so from 35 to 50%. There's still a large way to go on that front, a lot of area to increase participation in school meals. And again, since children experience food insecurity at the highest levels, this is a very well-targeted program that will increase the food security status of our children across the county. Turning to our final section, intersecting and upstream issues, we find that the upstream issues that folks who visit food pantries face, they're systemic issues, and they include historic marginalization, housing burdens, financial exclusion, and low and irregular pay. And we suggest that HFLC begin to address some of these systemic issues through strategic and innovative partnerships and investments in particularly underserved communities. We asked folks if they had experienced a forced move in the last year and if they were worried about experiencing a forced move in the next year, and found that 11% of all people who visited a food pantry were forced to move in the last year. That includes evictions, foreclosures, and an additional 22% were worried about being forced to move in the next year. So this is not a tangential issue to food insecurity, it's directly related. People reported their biggest economic trade-offs when they were asked about whether or not they had to choose between food and other expenses. Their biggest trade-offs were their mortgage and their rent and utilities. So a lot of people had to make that choice in Lancaster County. Pantries do and adapt to a wide variety of people's housing situations, and we suggest that we increase efforts to ensure that we have food offerings that are appropriate to everyone regardless of their living situation. And also consider developing eviction prevention interventions for pantry participants. They are much more likely than the general population of Lancaster County to experience forced moves. Again, eviction research has shown has major implications for long-term food security status, and that's particularly for children. Turning to financial access and inclusion, this was a really surprising finding from our research. We found that nearly 20% of people who visited food pantries did not have access to a checking or savings account, so they're unbanked. That is about 10 times higher than the statewide average, which is about 2.6%. And an additional 12% were underbanked. So that means that they have a checking or savings account, but they also utilize alternative financial services, which can be a lot more expensive than mainstream financial services. Some of the biggest barriers that people cite are lack of trust, high and unpredictable fees, and minimum balance requirements. So there's potential to have innovative collaborations with local financial institutions on this regard, as well as the recent financial literature points to the importance of trusted local partners. And as we've talked about, food pantries can serve that role, but it also talks about the importance of bankable moments. So when people receive their stimulus checks, a large number of individuals signed up for a checking or savings account, so there can be an opportunity around tax time as well if people receive a large refund, that working with food pantries around that time could be a way to increase financial inclusion in those areas. But again, there has to be financial offerings that are suited to low-income individuals. On the employment and income side of things, we found that just 30% or fewer of food pantry visitors are unemployed or underemployed. The main reasons that people cite for not being able to work in the last year, the number one reason was having to care for family. We all know how expensive childcare and a variety of other types of care are. Second largest reason is being ill or disabled. And then 16% of folks said that they couldn't find work. This means that more than 70% of pantry visitors are working full-time or on Social Security or receiving SSI or SSD. And implications for this is that workforce development resources could be important for particular individuals who can't find work. But again, most individuals who can work are working, who visit food pantries, and agencies in Hunger-Free Lancaster County can use this data to dispel myths and stereotypes about food pantry visitors. And it's also important that things like work requirements for SNAP will leave people behind who maybe aren't necessarily classified as being ill or disabled, but they can't work for that reason or many other reasons. And so advocating against those requirements is important because people will fall through the cracks and go hungry if those were made more strict. Turning to more in-depth look at people who work full-time and who report not having any weeks in the last year in which they weren't working. So we find in our data, just regardless of how we slice and dice it, income is the strongest determinant of food insecurity status. And this is largely in line with national research as well. Over half of working age, non-disabled, non-retired individuals work full-time. And 46% of people who work full-time and said that they worked every single week in the last year earned less than $24,000 a year. That equates to about $11.50 per hour. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's their rate, but folks also face irregular working schedules. They might not find out their working schedule very far in advance, and they might get 20 hours one week, 30 hours the next. So that kind of instability in the employment sector really challenges folks because they can't budget. They don't know how much income is coming in from one week to the next. And it just creates an overall, it puts a toll on workers and individuals who are working full time. So low wages are a systemic issue. If we remember the charitable food access cutoff, that was 185% of the federal poverty line. 22% of Lancastrians earn below that level of income, so relatively low income. And low and minimum wage issues impact people who visit food pantries, and it's important to talk about and advocate for family-sustaining wages. So next steps, one of the main goals of this report from the very beginning was to build into place sustainability into our data collection methods and our analysis so that we can track progress over time. So going forward, we believe that the report and recommendations can serve as a roadmap to reduce food insecurity in Lancaster County. And we've already been supporting and working very closely with Hunger-Free Lancaster County. They've been part of the process every step of the way through a consultative group of Lancaster County leaders that we met with on a regular basis. And so we'll continue to support the Hunger-Free Lancaster County in its strategic planning process and its implementation process of these recommendations, and also facilitate conversations with charitable food partners across the county and look to invest in strategic partnerships. We'll also continue to discuss and advocate for policy and regulatory implications of these findings. It's kind of rare to have this level of specificity at the county level, so we have some really good data to work with and to make decisions off of in Lancaster County. And then continuing to increase our engagement with all of Lancaster County. It's important that everybody recognizes the extent of food insecurity in their communities. And again, as I mentioned, this report will not be once and done, but we plan to refresh this data on a regular basis so that we can track and measure our progress over time and kind of adjust our strategies and initiatives accordingly. So that is it for our presentation. We're happy to open it up for questions if we have time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much to our presenters. And I know that was a lot of data. We will follow up with both a video recording and a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. So if you need to look at some of those charts again in a little bit more depth, we will send those out. So let me start over here with a question, and we'll go around and see what other thoughts we have.
Great presentation. Thank you for coming today. I'm curious if you had a magic wand, what you could change or what maybe policies you would change in our food distribution system or network. If there's any legislation maybe that you would change, or, you know, we all know of how food can be wasted in restaurants or even grocery stores. Is there, if you could change anything, I know that's a broad question, but if you could pick one, what would that be?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. If I could change any policy, I would go back to the expanded child tax credit. I think that's extremely well targeted, but on the food distribution side of things, there's already a significant effort to rescue like retail foods. There's lots of collaborations on that front, even with farms as well, through the PASS program, through a variety of different programs. So I would continue those efforts. I think it's also just kind of really important to make sure that people know where existing resources are and that we have consistent policies and consistent treatment of people across those areas. We find that if folks are treated poorly when they visit a food pantry, that there's a good chance that they won't go back. So I think a kind of a holistic view of continuing those efforts on the retail rescue, the partnerships with farms, but also making sure that our system's as accessible as it can be, because it doesn't do any good to have the food there and not have it necessarily be accessible.
Thank you so much, first of all. So I realize that the first thing that people really need is food, right? At one point in my life, I was food insecure, and something that was really empowering for me was to be able to grow my own food. And I'm just wondering if there has been any attempt to work with food banks to have supplies for people to grow their own food as well, by partnering with like greenhouses, something like that, to have just simple supplies, even if it's seeds and some, planters, things like that, or even seedlings that maybe they have a surplus of. Because even if it's as simple as having a plant that's giving you a surplus of cucumbers, things like that, it can make a really big difference. I know that a lot of our food banks, they have, a surplus of canned goods, but they have trouble sometimes accessing a lot of fresh foods. And I'm just wondering if there's any way for us to think more creatively as a community to really empower folks to get their hands dirty. And I know that you can do things with very small spaces to really empower people.
So your Penn State Ag Extension is your folks for that, and they are actually actively working on that. Came to our food bank a couple weeks ago to talk about that, in particular because, of course, they have a group of motivated gardeners who can produce so much food, and then they're like, well, now what? So first and foremost, that's in the works, and I think our direction has been to say, well, okay, you've got your extra produce, rather than trying to bring it all the way to a food bank, which acts as a distribution hub, connect with a local pantry who is looking for that resource. To your end about seeds and seedlings, SNAP is able to be used at farmers markets, which sometimes they will sell like plants, but also SNAP can be used to purchase seeds. So people who have that resource available to them can do that. Is growing your own food the solution to food insecurity? It's probably a piece of giving people maybe a sense of pride in being able to do so. But also, I've grown tomatoes for years, and sometimes you just get a crop that you're like, wow, this was really worth the 20 weeks of waiting. So I think we want to consider that a tomato plant alone is not going to resolve somebody's hunger situation, and of course, which and that's but I think that is one solution that people can take charge of in a way that is a little different than maybe just receiving a box of food. But that is there are conversations happening around that, and I would say, our Penn State Ag Extension and Master Gardener folks are very motivated to share their abundance with their community as well.
Could you talk about the makeup of these food pantries? I know there used to be the Council of Churches Food Bank, and I think that evolved into the Food Hub because we used to do donations there, and I know our own church does a monthly collection, and I think they're affiliated with some other churches in the city, but I have personal ignorance about some of that and how they're networking. But then you were talking about the different policies, income-based, school-based, and is there a central clearing food pantry house that communicates with all these different groups? Some are probably faith-based, some are not. So if you're trying to talk about uniform policies, like who is talking to all these people, I think are doing good work, but probably have some philosophical differences about who is eligible and who is not.
Right. Yeah, in Lancaster County, Hunger-Free Lancaster County serves as that resource and is continuing to try to engage all pantries more and more. As I mentioned, it's a very decentralized system, which is good in many ways, but it is hard to communicate. So I think regional sessions where we talk about the findings and policies. We presented some of our initial findings at these listening sessions, and folks were just like very interested, very receptive. A lot of it is an information issue. It can be very complicated, like to understand what's allowed and what's not. So Hunger-Free Lancaster County, with support of the food bank and other organizations, key organizations across the county, including the Food Hub and CAP and all of those individuals, can help kind of clarify those things, because a lot of people have like really good intentions across the county, and so this inconsistency in policy is just kind of an information issue, I think. Yeah. So there's a lot. There's 40 that we included in this study. There are some like very small like pop-ups that aren't necessarily considered consistent access, but they vary dramatically. Some just do that, and some are a church or a collection of churches, and others offer like a more wide variety of social services, as well as their food pantry.
Hi. So one of the things you mentioned is for people to know where they can find these resources at. Is there currently some sort of platform, whether it's digital or physical, where people can not just know where these food locations are, but also know whether or not they need ID, whether or not they need billing or a bill? Like, what does the access of knowledge look like for that person at this time?
Yeah, there's a find food feature on the Central Pennsylvania Food Bank website, but it doesn't have all of that information. One of the ways that we suggest Hunger-Free Lancaster County could help collaborate along all these things is to create a resource like that. But it is difficult to keep up with that many pantries all the time, and people's policies, their hours do change. There's also obviously 211, which is a great resource, and a lot of our pantries are on that as well. And so people get connected through a variety of different ways, but it's often hard to know what policy you might face before you show up.
Yeah. In Lancaster County in particular, people are comfortable accessing 211 for those services. I think people are kind of used to doing that for a lot of access to services. That's how we've kind of set it up. We've done similar projects we are doing similar projects in Cumberland and also Lebanon County. And a difference to point out for Lancaster is that in Cumberland, it's word of mouth. That's how you find out. And it's not to say that people don't find out via word of mouth in Lancaster, but that consistently people would say, oh yeah, I found out because I Googled it, and it came up on 211. Whereas in Cumberland, it was, oh, my neighbor took me because I said I was out of food. So that's a source that people are already looking to. And so as long as that is comprehensive and robust, we have a much better chance of getting that info to folks. And another one of our sort of sub-findings is that if we are willing to loosen the idea of a pantry only being able to serve a certain school district or zip code, that pantries could advertise other pantries. So that if you are a person who is driving past a pantry that you don't even know about, that is a place that you can go, on your way to, maybe visiting the Food Hub or another resource. So connections like that are things that people don't necessarily know about unless they know to look, and it's kind of on the Charitable Food Network to make that obvious for folks.
You mentioned the universal breakfast program for the students, and so I have grandchildren that live across the state of Pennsylvania, and I asked them about that, and I asked them about the program. And basically what the kids are getting is French toast sticks and sugary cereals. And I think we're missing an educational opportunity. And how do we get the schools to give and provide something with more protein and less carbohydrates for the kids?
Yeah, so schools before universal breakfast face a wide variety of kind of complexities of that program. So hopefully with the consistency and kind of reliability that the universal school breakfast program could provide, they can focus on some of the other aspects rather than just like trying to get kids to sign up. So that is an issue. It depends on the school, and it also depends. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, we didn't collect data specifically on what kinds of foods that they were offering. I think the first step is to make sure that they offer food in general, like whether it's accessible to people after the bell. But I think that's also another really important next step. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And it does vary based on budget of the school.
Yeah.
So it's a requirement from a state standpoint, but depending on the school district and the funds that are available will also depend on the quality of the food that's being provided.
Yeah, and that's the thing that the universal breakfast could hopefully provide, like some more consistency of like, this is our budget for food, and maybe we can get higher quality food.
Hi. The question I have is about colleges and universities. I just started working at Franklin Marshall College, and one of the things I will be overseeing is the granola bar, which is our food bank on campus. I'm curious if you looked at any of those in your study, and if you have anything to add about food insecurity for college students. I think it's like 14% typically, food insecurity. Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely a major issue. We did not specifically look at that in this report. But it's obviously a critical investment point.
Explain why, because it's not open.
Oh yeah. One of our principles with the report was to focus on places where anybody could go to, regardless of age or status. And so that was one of the restrictions with some of the college pantries, which do really, really amazing work, but not necessarily community members can access. But again, college students wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable accessing other community resources outside of the campus, so it's a really great offering. And then again, a very critical time to invest in people. If you are trying to complete your college degree and facing food insecurity, that is a huge barrier. You guys are doing great work, as well as several other colleges across Lancaster County, in particular, like Millersville.
So do you have any idea how many college students go to pantries outside of their institutions for food? Was that involved in
Yeah, we did ask if people are going to school. I believe it was about 1%, if I'm remembering off the top of my head. Yeah, it's pretty low. Yeah.
Well, I know we have some more questions, but we're actually at time for today, so hopefully our presenters can hang out for a little bit and you can have a chance to connect with them. Let's give Zach and Dawn a round of applause. Thank you so much for your very hard work and pulling this data together for our community, but also sharing it with us today. And we will have a video recording of today's presentation on our website and YouTube channel next week, so please share that with other folks in the community. And I just wanted to let you know we will come back here on September 8th. So we are delayed 1 week for our next First Friday Forum because of Labor Day weekend. So you can all go have a pool party and then join us back here on Friday, September 8th. We have a really interesting forum in the works, especially for folks who are interested in YIMBYism, so how we can get some more housing in other parts of the community outside of Lancaster City. So if you're interested in that topic, come back. And if you want invitations to all of our First Friday forums, you can become an Hourglass member on our website at hourglasslancaster.org. So until then, have a great weekend, and thanks all for coming out today.